Welcome back to this study on fiction writing. I'm Kenny Noble, your instructor, and today we're going to be looking at plot. There are so many books out there written about plot. Some of them are good, and all of them, of course, have something valuable to offer. But today I want to try to cover at least the basics of plot and hopefully give you some ideas to help you find the end to your story and perhaps make your story better. First, let's define what I mean by plot. Plot is more than just whatever happens in your story. Plot is the strategy. It's the significant events of your story. And of course, plot, by its very nature, determines, in part, the structure of your story. And by that I mean some plots demand that certain things happen. Other plots demand that other things happen for them to work properly. Plot is the way of looking at things. It's the way of deciding what things are going to happen. It's deciding what's important to you, the way things have meaning to you. But for the most part, I think the right word for plot is probably strategy. It's how you're going to get from the beginning of your story to the end. And there are certain events that must happen to make that story successful. In a later lecture, we'll try to spend some time looking at the internal arc of the character, which is an important part of your story. But I should point out now that in many ways, there are two stories in your novel. There's the inner story of the main character's internal arc, and then there's the outer story, which is kind of the housing or the casing that the inner story goes in. So for the most part, in this lecture, we're going to be talking about the outer story, the outer journey. Because the main character's inner journey is a story all its own, and it deserves quite a bit of time, some special attention. But just know that there can be an outer plot and there can be an inner plot. The outer plot is the story itself. The inner plot is the main character's journey, their learning experience. Because in a good story, every main character should change. They're not the same at the end of the story as they were at the beginning. Also, keep in mind that plot is dynamic. It's not static. And while you're writing your story, your plot may change. You may come to a place in your story that you'll see something else just has to happen, and that wasn't in your original plans. Well, that's a good thing, and probably you should allow your characters to take that road that they want to take. So plot is dynamic. Things change. And I think that one of the greatest lessons that I've learned is that plot grows out of character. Plot is what happens to the character. They're what the book is really about. So sometimes your character grows during your story and you realize your character wouldn't do the very thing that you had planned for them at the outset, but this character has taken on an identity of their own, and you have to let that character grow. But even so, any action that your character makes, anything that happens, has to be for a reason. It shouldn't be at random. And if there's not a reason for it, it probably doesn't belong in your story. And before we get started, I want to also mention that not every writer plots their story out from beginning to end. In my research, I've discovered that those who write a lot typically do plot their story out from beginning to end because they believe that it's a time saver. But there are two types of writers, the plotters who plan and outline, and then there are the pantsers. And I think the term comes from those that just write by the seat of their pants. They have an idea, they sit down and start writing their story, and they write it all the way through to the end without doing outlines or thinking a lot about it. What happens, happens. Neither one of these are a better method of writing. However, the pantser probably has to go back and revise their story more, unless they're extremely skilled, whereas the plotter puts the extra work in at the beginning and prep. So neither is better. I prefer the plotter method, but that's my writing style. Each person has to find out what works for them. Someone said that there are really only four basic plots, and that's man against man against God, man against self, and man against the elements. And that does make sense. That simplifies everything, and it seems like that every story could possibly fit in one of those four categories. However, someone else came along and said, well, I think there's more than that. I think there are 12 plots. And each one of those plots can be divided into subplots. And then somebody else come along and said, I think there are 21 plots. And then someone came along and said, there's a maximum of 36 plots. And probably everyone is right. It depends upon what level you want to break the plot down into. So I want to look at a few plots here that I think are important and kind of give you some ideas. Remember, in another lecture we said that you have to have a story problem and you have to have a good story problem. Well, each story problem is going to entail its own plot points. That is, each story problem has certain elements that are by nature part of that story problem. The plot is what characters do in overcoming obstacles and a progression toward a resolution. Characters' motives must be believable because plot isn't just a matter of things happening. Instead, it's a constant progression toward the resolution. First, let's look at the quest plot. The quest plot is the protagonist's search for a person, place, or thing, something tangible, whether it's King Arthur's table searching for the Holy Grail, or it's Indiana Jones searching for the Lost Ark. And the quest plot will always have an element in it which is often referred to as the MacGuffin. The MacGuffin is the element that the protagonist is in search of. It could be another person. It could be something of value. It could actually be an idea or a way of living. And the story isn't really about the MacGuffin so much as it's about the journey and the things that the protagonist learns during the journey of that quest plot. In the story of The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy's quest plot is that she wants to return home. In Disney's Shrek 1, the quest is that Shrek has to save the princess from the fiery dragon. And usually, a hallmark of the quest plot is that there's a companion, there's a sidekick. So in Shrek 1, it was the donkey. In Don Quixote, it was Panza. So by the end of Act 1 in the quest plot, the reader should understand clearly exactly what it is the main character wants. What is their quest? So Act 1 is asking the question. Act 2 is facing the obstacles along the journey. And Act 3 is resolving the quest plot, reaching the goal, and coming to a resolution. Next, let's look at the revenge story. The first stage of the revenge story is the crime. The hero or heroine and their loved ones are established and living happily when suddenly there's a crime that terminates their happiness. Shakespeare's Hamlet is probably the most famous revenge story ever told. And the story opens with Hamlet discovering that his uncle probably killed his father. The second stage of the revenge plot is revenge. The main character plots out or plans some method of revenge. Oftentimes there's a third party in this revenge plot that's trying to stop them from revenge. That could be the sidekick or it could be the antagonist himself. And the third dramatic stage of the revenge plot is the confrontation. The main character faces the person upon whom they want to obtain revenge, and they have their showdown. Next, let's look at the riddle plot. The riddle plot is really a mystery story, and it's really two stories in one. It's the story of what happened and the story of what appears to have happened. And we know by nature that in the riddle plot, things are not what they seem on the surface. There are plenty of clues that lie within the words and the actions of the characters. Oftentimes in the riddle plot, there's a red herring. Something's thrown into the story that appears to be a clue, which really isn't a clue at all. And this red herring has to be handled skillfully because you don't want the reader to be angry because you've misled them. So if you use a red herring, be sure and leave some clear clues that at the end of the story, the reader could look back and say, oh, I should have seen that. I should have seen that coming. So the first dramatic stage of the riddle plot is that something happens. There's a dead body, a bank is robbed, someone's hurt, and there's a mystery that is begging to be solved. The second stage is the processing, the going down dead ends, gathering information, sending out feelers, coming against obstacles. But as the story progresses, they get closer and closer to the truth, to finding out who really done it. And at the same time, the stakes get higher. And finally, in the third dramatic stage of this riddle plot, we discover who done it. We have a resolution. Everything comes to a close. And of course, the author has challenged the reader to try and figure out the riddle before they reach the last page. And it should really come as no surprise to the reader. You don't want a cliche ending, but you also don't want the reader to be disappointed. You want them to look back and say, I should have picked up on that. I should have seen those clues. And always explain the motive of the antagonist. And of course, don't close the story until you've explained the real happening of events as opposed to what looked like happened. Then we have the underdog plot. A good example of this is the famous Cinderella story. And of course, there's dozens and dozens, probably hundreds, of underdog plots that have been made into movies because we like those type of plots. We like that story. We want to hear it again and again. In the underdog plot, things are not equal. There's not a level playing field. The protagonist is at an extreme disadvantage. It looks like there's no way that they can win or overcome their situation. The novel Ben-Hur is a good underdog plot, which was, by the way, the first novel that Sears and Roebuck published in their Kellogg. The first phase of the underdog plot is usually at the time when we can get a glimpse of the main character's life before they were thrust in this unfavorable condition. The second phase begins when the protagonist challenges her rival, or his rival, and tries to reverse the descending force in the first dramatic phase. So as we see in the story of Cinderella, she was thrust in this situation when her father remarried and she was put in with stepmother and stepsisters, but her situation began to change in the power balance when she started to receive help from the fairy godmother. And of course, the third dramatic stage is when the disempowered meets her rival and they're on an equal basis. One of the important things that must be in the underdog plot, the underdog must want to succeed. They must want to get out of their situation. And as I pointed out, the underdog must be unequally matched. Next, there's the rescue plot. The rescue plot is, of course, a physical plot. It's very similar to the escape plot. We have a victim that is stolen away, kidnapped, or taken from their position, and the hero accepts the quest to try to rescue the victim. So the first act is the separation, the second act is the pursuit, and the third act is the confrontation between the protagonist and the antagonist. And in the rescue plot, the protagonist and the antagonist are usually the strongest forces, and the victim usually is the weakest force. Similar to the rescue plot is the escape plot. The escape plot is told from the point of view of the person that has been kidnapped or put in a certain situation. In phase one, the protagonist is imprisoned somehow. This doesn't always have to be a physical prison. Of course, it could be a situation that the main character's put in. Phase two of the escape plot deals with the imprisoned making plans and trying to escape. In most cases, the reader knows what's going to happen. They know that the imprisoned will probably be successful in their escape, but we like the journey. And of course, the third phase of this plot is the escape itself. Sometimes wild cards come into play. Things that we didn't know was going to happen. Sometimes the hero finds help in an unlikely source, someone that perhaps was the henchman or a helper with the antagonist suddenly becomes their friend to help them get away. Next, there's the pursuit plot. It's kind of a hide-and-seek plot, and I'm guessing this plot would probably be well used for an ongoing TV series or an ongoing novel series where the main character, the protagonist, is in pursuit of something or someone, and they meet a lot of obstacles along the way. And although they partially resolve their problem, they never really find that pot of gold or that lost family member they're looking for because there has to be one more episode. So phase one begins with an inciting incident, someone being taken away from the protagonist or something being taken away, and he's constantly in pursuit of this. The second dramatic phase is just the chase. He's after this person, after this thing that's gotten away from him. And of course, the third dramatic phase is resolving the chase. Classic example would be the coyote and the roadrunner. The roadrunner always gets away from the coyote, but we enjoy watching the chase. And we can't forget about Batman and Superman, who are always chasing the enemy. Next is the forbidden love plot. Many famous stories have been written on this plot. There's the Hunchback of Notre Dame, of course, Romeo and Juliet. Scarlet Letter comes to mind. Madame Bovary. This forbidden love plot has at its basis the idea that their love goes against the conventions of their culture, of their society. So the first dramatic phase should define the relationship between the two people. And the second dramatic phase should be the lovers in the heart of their relationship and how they're trying to maintain the relationship in spite of their culture. Of course, the third dramatic phase should take the lovers to the end of their relationship and settle all the moral scores. And the lovers are often separated by death, force, or desertion. The metamorphosis plot. The metamorphosis plot is about change. The physical characteristics of one of the characters change from one form or another, such as the Wolfman, Beauty and the Beast, Dracula. And in some ways, the metamorphosis plot is about how the forces of good and evil inside of us are waging war within us. And sometimes the evil sways us one way and sometimes the good. And the one that metamorphs is usually the protagonist. And keep in mind, not all metamorphoses are evil. We have transformation, the transformation plot. An example of this would be the Red Badge of Courage, in which the hero changes from his cowardly personality at the beginning to more of a hero by the time we reach the end. Another example would be George Bernard Shaw's My Fair Lady, where Henry Higgins, a teacher of English speech, transforms Eliza Doolittle, a Cockney flower girl, into a seemingly English lady by teaching her to speak cultivated English. There's the maturation plot. This is often called the coming of age. Huckleberry Finn would be a good example. Next, let's look at the sacrifice plot. In the sacrifice plot, the characters sacrifice themselves for some higher purpose. They subscribe to the belief that the needs of many outweigh the needs of the individual. A good example of this is one of my favorite stories titled The Tin Star. Later it was made into a movie called High Noon. It should give you some direction on what to look for and how to analyze your stories. There are a few more I could mention. For example, the discovery story where the main character discovers something about themselves. An example of that would be the play Death of a Salesman, in which this man realizes at the end that he never really was emotionally whole. There's also the temptation plot, where the main character is tempted to do something wrong or immoral. Of course, the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden is a good example of that. And last of all, there's the rivalry plot, where it's two opposing forces against each other. Examples of that would be Lord of the Flies, the old cowboy classic, The Virginian, Herman Melville's Billy Budd, even The Old Man and the Sea. So that should get you well on your way to understanding the basics of plots. I've just given you some ideas what to look for, and it's good that when you're writing your story at the outset, you try to categorize it and say, well, what situation does my story fit in? Is it man against man? Is it man against God? How could I divide it down further? Is it a rivalry plot? Is it a riddle, a quest? And when you discover what plot best fits the story that you have in mind, then you would look for the dramatic phases that you need. Well, if it's a mystery plot, a riddle, then what's the most natural events that I need in this plot? What would help my story? So we'll stop there. I hope these ideas have been good for you, that they'll give you some clarity for your writing and help you in your future endeavors. And I hope to see you again in another lecture.